our next keynote, we continue on the theme of readiness, preparing for the critical role of inclusivity and accessibility for all. We're so pleased to have with us today Sinéad Burke, who will be talking about Are We Ready for Cities of the Future? Please welcome Sinéad.
For access reasons, I'm going to begin with a visual description of myself. It's useful for those who are blind and low vision, but also for those who are sitting at the back. My name is Sinéad. I'm a white cisgendered woman who uses the pronouns she and her. I identify as queer and physically disabled. I'm a little person. I have dwarfism. I have brown shoulder-length hair that, despite the best attempts of both a blow dryer and a hair straightener, is kicking out to the ways in which I wouldn't like to admit. And I am wearing a custom Prada dress. Thank you, Mucha. And custom Salvatore Ferragamo heels. My apologies, it's not a cold wall, 2025. When we think of the theme for the 2025 Biennale, and genuinely to have been in this room for the day has been the greatest of privileges. The topic of surface reflections is fundamental to my practice, both personally and professionally. As we think about the topic and the theme of today, are we ready for cities of the future? I want to start with kind of a personal reflection. So much of what Samuel spoke about this morning was about looking to history and ensuring that that discipline and the multiplicity of the history and the future are brought together. So when we think about accessibility, one of the things that we're going to investigate today is how do we even define it? But what are the limitations and why are we where we are currently as regards to the lack of progress in terms of meaningful accessibility? For me, the ableism that exists in society is a muscle memory. I'm really glad the minister is no longer here as I make this comment. 2020 was a transformative moment for me. As a disabled woman looking to England and thinking about the positioning of disability in society. Within the first phase of the pandemic here in England, 6 out of 10 people who died of COVID-19 were disabled. And we created a new lexicon in order to disassociate ourselves from the harm that was being caused. If we discovered that somebody died of COVID-19, what was the question that we asked? Were they? Come on, you know it. It's not that long. Were they old? It's a hint of ageism and ableism. Yes, were they old? But we had a word, began with V. Were they vulnerable? Which was a synonym for what? Disabled. Or the other one was, did they have underlying conditions? As if their death was more acceptable, because it wasn't us. While at the same time, every single press briefing that the UK Prime Minister had didn't have a what? A sign language interpreter. It was a deliberate decision as to who gets to receive vital communication around health and access. But even more, it's a symbol of who we value. That's our most recent past. And if we think about the future, can you sense the level of discomfort in the room? Take a deep breath, shake out your shoulders. But if we think about that past and we think about the cities of the future, what are the mandates and the matrices that we want to abide by? I'm really proud and slightly nervous to be here today because you all in this room as stakeholders have a fundamental impact on my life. As I shared in my visual description, I'm a little person. I'm disabled by design. I live in a world that wasn't designed for me. I live in a world that was designed by you. And that creates the friction within my inaccessibility and how it arises. But design is a powerful tool, both in the physical design of the built environment and products, but also in how our biases and policies shape the world. But recently I had an experience where I got to design the world for me. I've bought my first home. It's a very big deal as a disabled woman who's self-employed. The banks don't love that. I used to believe I couldn't cook, but I couldn't cook because I couldn't cook in an inaccessible kitchen. My kitchen is now designed for me. The counter heights are 60 centimeters high. If you were to be in my home, you would be disabled. We have designed and created a set of norms and rules as to how the world exists, and in turn, ensured that so many people not just feel excluded, but are left behind. So today, we're going to try and come up with a new framework. This is a quote from one of my favorite architects, Simone de Gale, who's based here in London. She said, "It was never that disabled people did not exist, the buildings were simply inaccessible." We are currently in Chatham House. This building has a global moniker around privacy and security. There are 5 entrances to this stage, not one of them without a step. And while there can be ramps that are brought to this space to create access, each of those entrances is a symbol of who doesn't get to be in rooms like this. And when we think about building ecosystems and building more sustainable populations, how do these symbols continue to illustrate who doesn't get to be in the room? Now, I'm not hugely taken by the concept of artificial intelligence. However, this is a useful example. Last week, I put this in and asked it to create a city of the future. On screen is 4 images, all of which has been probably framed by science fiction and some sort of global panacea with an ecosystem in the epicenter. I mean, how would you describe this? Idyllic, probably. What I then asked it to describe was, what's an accessible city of the future? Now, before I put the image up, I want you to imagine it. How bad do you think it's going to be compared? Not bad, right? Not terrible. There is an interesting and creative interpretation of the international symbol of disability in the bottom right-hand corner. As we say in Ireland, fair play to them. But what they have focused on is ramp access. The definition of accessibility being that which those who use wheelchairs, for example, may be able to access. But this again feels idyllic when we think about cities of the future. So I have a potential thesis when we think about how the world, and particularly cities, needs to consider the broadest possible access. I think there's 3 pillars: built environment, policy, and communication. And built environment not just being about the physical creation of spaces, but also how we think about infrastructure, how we think about transport, how we think about education and schooling, how everything from your home, inside and outside, exists. Policy, both that is mandated by government, but also the social contracts that we take on as a people. Let me give you an example of a social contract. Let's say your friend is pregnant. You ask them the slightly absurd and out-of-date question of what gender the baby is. What does your friend say? "I don't know, I just want the baby to be..." What's that a synonym of? There are so many social contracts that exist within our society that shape the world that we live in. We need to dissolve each one of them one at a time. But also communication, the information we share, the information we do not share. It was really important to me personally today that there was a British Sign Language interpreter on stage. I don't know if there has been one here before. But often we expect people from marginalized communities to do the emotional labor in order to participate that those from non-marginalized backgrounds don't have to do. We expect them to raise their arm should they be able to and say, "I need," rather than creating ecosystems and systems in particular that are set up for people to thrive. I don't know if there's anybody deaf in the room, but there might be next year. How do we create those equitable pathways in order for people to succeed? And in terms of communication, often people will tell you that even in places like Somerset House, which are amazing and beautiful, they may not tell you the distance from the gate all the way to the door. What is the level of information that we don't provide to people because of the biases that exist within our own muscle memory? And then in terms of the stakeholders, design, governance, civil society, corporate, which in many ways means all of us. So where are we as a current positioning? Now, this is where, in the afternoon, you've all had caffeine, and I'm going to rely on it. What does accessibility mean? And you should know I have a background in primary school teaching. which is useful for two things. One, I'm excellent with silence. And two, eventually one of you will become so uncomfortable that you will rescue each other and answer. So, what does accessibility mean? Give me a definition. Somebody is already sweating. We have about 200 designers in the room, and not one person can give me a definition of access. Chris.
Thank you, Sinead. An equitable experience for all.
See, this is where I tell you that Chris is a client of mine, and he may or may not have had a cheat sheet on a definition of access. Yes. What does access usually mean?
I guess it's often meant as physical
Yeah.
access.
Yeah.
Left like that.
Do designers love accessibility? Ah, come on. No. Why? Is it beautiful? Can be. Is it usually? No. It's usually a ramp around the back by the bins, rather than being inspired by the Guggenheim in New York, which is also a ramp, just not out the back by the bins. We often view it through the lens of compliance, and if it meets Part M, particularly from a UK perspective or the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is in and of itself enough. Why? Why is it enough? This is why the architects don't meet my eye, especially if they're not neurodivergent. Because it's not for us. It's not for you. It's enough because you've done the minimum, and why don't we get back to the actual artistic practice? When the reality is we will all become disabled at some point in our lives. And that sounds like a threat. But actually it's an invitation to an incredible community. And whether you're wearing eyeglasses, whether you have a momentary disability around a chronic illness, whether you get older, this isn't about us and them, this is about all of us at any time. And how do we think about equity of experience as a principal default lever, the way we think about design? And in terms of it being not about us and them, here in the UK, for example, it's 16% of the population. Globally, it's around 25%. But what we know from a global north and global south perspective is that when there is moments of conflict, the increase of disability is so incredibly high. Whether we look to Palestine or Ukraine or Sudan, it is a mass disabling event. How are we designing within our future programs, even thinking about sustainability and access coming together? 70% of their disabled people acquire their disability in their lifetime. So me, as somebody who was born with it, unique. And often when we think about design and disability, we think about it from the perspective of designing for. We have moved to processes of thinking about co-design, but even co-design works with disabled people, doesn't empower them to be in powerful positions, even on themselves. And as Samuel Ross said earlier, lived experience is intellectual property. I'm going to get that tattooed on myself somewhere, or at least on a tote bag. But the reality is that in terms of the unemployment rate of disabled people across the globe, the statistics range between 50 and 75%. And that is often because even when we employ disabled people, we have assumptions over their level of qualification. We believe that they can and should only do menial jobs. In France and Italy, there is baseline requirements from governments. In France, you must have 6% of your organization be disabled. In Italy, it's 8%. What do you think is the fee for a global multinational corporation in those countries if they do not meet the targets? So is it worse if it's not much, or is it worse if it's huge? It's €1 million a year. So why would you ever make it an investment if it's always going to be a cost? But as we look to climate change and sustainability, and particularly even as we look to frameworks around sustainability and the future of cities, BREEAM and LEAP and LEAD and others don't allow for accessibility criteria. Even to date, the only framework we're using is compliance. But what we know is that within climate change scenarios, disabled people are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be injured in climate emergencies. 59% of deaf evacuees do not return home, and disabled people in disasters face inaccessible transportation. But now that we've done the really grim bit, what are the opportunities? So if we think about this purely from a financial metric to start with, so that you can all go back to CEOs and ensure that this is prioritized on strategic agendas. What Accenture has found in their disability inclusion report is that companies that continue to invest in the strategic priority of accessibility are being able to measure very transparently the difference between them and their market competitors as regards to revenue, net income, and economic profit. We know that the global disabled population has a spending power of about £1.5 trillion per year. But we cannot just keep thinking of disabled people as consumers. We cannot allow the market to dictate a readiness that is needed right now. These people should be our colleagues. These people should be our creative directors. Companies with inaccessible websites lose about $5 billion per annum. How many people use alt text on their Instagram posts? How many people know what alt text is? Thank you. There's your homework. And what we know is that £10 billion in design spending is set to shift to companies that prioritize accessibility. And as we think about mental health and mental illness as a fraction of disability, programs that invest in this can generate an investment of up to 800%. And while these financial metrics are important, they give us the criteria by which we look to this as an investment and not a cost. But economic growth is but one lever we need to use as we think about change. From a design position, it has to be about creativity. So in terms of solutions, how do we measure and create a matrix based on high impact, high resource, low impact, low resource? As shared at the very beginning, I work at a company called Tilting the Lens and work with an all-disabled team across Europe with an international footprint. Here are some of the things that we're really interested in exploring over the next 6 months. So as we think about built environment policy and communication, pilot example of meaningful accessibility, looking at equity of experience as the rationale rather than compliance. Budgeting for accessibility centrally and within departments within organizations, because if you don't spend your accessibility budget by the end of the year, why? And if you spend it in December, why? It's a really useful metric. Looking at design guidelines, clear communications about on-site accessibility, provision of information in multiple formats, and accessibility training. But looking to next year, employment targets for the recruitment, promotion, and retention of disabled people, auditing of accessibility budgeting and iteration, review of policy and planning for ableism, accessibility as a key stakeholder in all refurbishments and new developments, curriculum design on accessibility beyond compliance, and an accessibility framework, and then looking to awarding of accessibility framework accreditation, impact measurement of accessibility features, quantifying the return of investment, review of legislation on listed buildings. When do we stop putting architecture before people? Or when do we find a way to join the dots for them not to be in conflict with the two together? So I have 5 ideas as we think about long-term success. We need representation of disabled people in decision-making. They need to be able to get into 10 Downing Street first, though. Accessibility beyond compliance. If somebody says to you that something's accessible, say, really, how? For who? Investing in accessibility rather than looking at it as a barrier for creative progress. Looking at architecture training, but training overall, and disabled design innovation, which is about how do we move from co-design to thinking about disabled people at the heart of a process. A question was asked earlier around scaling and around education. One of the things that I'm really proud of is that my background is actually in the fashion industry. And while I think it's great that the fashion industry is currently targeting more and more disabled consumers, what we need is disabled designers. So one of the solutions is that we've created a partnership with Parsons School of Design and a fully funded program for 3 disabled designers to start there in September. They will have their housing paid for, they will have their tuition paid for, and if they do not need or want to get a job or can't, they will also have a living stipend. We will have 3 disabled designers starting every year for the next 4 years. You know what my job is between now and then? To make Paris, Milan, London, and New York accessible. Because guess what? Having a beautiful custom Prada dress is incredible. But if you're always the exception and not the vehicle by which a pipeline of talent get to access an industry, what's the point? I have 2 minutes left, and I've been told I can ask you to ask me questions. But I want to thank you so much for your time today and for participating in what I hope was not too much of dialogue. But does anybody have any questions? And thank you so much to the interpreters. That was an absolute marathon. Any questions? Hello.
Hi, Sinead.
Hi.
I can probably do that. I've got a loud voice.
For access, I'm going to give you the microphone.
Okay. Hi, it's Dimitri. I work with Ben at London Design Festival. I was really interested by the financial metrics, and I was wondering whether that's on the basis of sort of the emotional. Well, what drives the kind of improved financial metrics from having representation in the workforce? I didn't quite understand that.
So in terms of what drives the financial metrics?
Incremental revenues, incremental profit.
So I think it's a mix of things. So fundamentally, it is about customer sentiment. It is also about then the innovation that is possible by having that representation within those organizations. So to give you an example, on Sloane Street here in London, there is a luxury retailer that we supported having a deaf person who's a client advisor in that store. Not sure if you've been into a luxury retail store recently. They're quite intimidating spaces, or at least can be. When we suggested the idea and that this person would have a full-time British Sign Language interpreter with them, there was immediately a question from the organization around headcount, also around what does this mean for profitability? How do you think that person's doing?
Presumably very well.
Yeah, they're in the top 5 client advisors in that store and have been since they started. Because also what it's an opportunity is for deaf people or people who can sign to come to that store and to transact individually, people who like or don't like that brand. So the way in which the metrics are often qualified is around customer sentiment, it's around the innovation opportunities that exist when disabled people are at place, but it's also thinking about, the holistic definition of access. So we define it as people, places, policy, product, and promotions. So really thinking as broad as possible and then quantify it. But would love to connect you with the Accenture team who'll be able to explain it in more detail. Thank you. I think I'm, yeah. Yeah, oh, hello.
Hi there. Thank you so much. Super inspired. Zula Malamogo from TC and Friends. I wanted to ask, who is supporting the partnership you're doing with Parsons School of Design? And again, well done on just creating something so sustainable. I can't wait to see what they create.
So we have funding from the Ford Foundation, we have funding from individual philanthropists and organizations, and we have funding from H&M, which is quite interesting in terms of fast fashion being involved in something that you would typically position at a luxury level. We are currently, this is me doing a book plug, but I don't have a book, but currently thinking about in terms of scaling that funding, what does that look like? So we have been looking at 501(c)(3)s and not-for-profits, but also individual organizations. So in terms of the work, the other thing that we're interested in, and particularly for relevance of this room, if you're interested in mentoring, if you're interested in guest lecturing, if you're interested in creating pathways to support those talents where there's non-economic requirement, please do get in touch, because it's also about making sure that there's a readiness for these students, that they themselves, in order to go into these sectors, because what we're trying to prove, whilst also not putting the labor on the disabled people themselves, is that the system can be ready for them, and we're not yet there. So if you can help, this is my email. Please get in touch. Gurmila Malgrove, thank you so much.